Hello and
Hi.
welcome. Hello, welcome to this webinar, A Future for Early Intervention, Lessons Learned and the Potential Transformation of Specialized Early Psychosis Services. Today we have a bunch of great presenters from the Felton Institute, and this webinar is sponsored by SAMHSA. And there's a disclaimer. So one of the most common questions is, will this webinar be recorded? Yes. This webinar is being recorded, and the presentation and audio recording will be available at our website, power2.org. Another common question is, are there CEUs offered? And no, there are not CEUs offered, but you can get a certificate of attendance. So at the end of the webinar, there'll be a Q&A session, and in your dialog box, you should see that you have a question function, and you're invited to ask questions at any time with the question function, and the questions will be taken in the order that they're received. So as far as an agenda, I'm Oryx Cohen. I'm with the National Empowerment Center. We're very happy to be hosting this webinar. In addition to the question function, there's also a chat function that you can use. And as far as a little bit of background, at the National Empowerment Center, one of our focus areas is crisis response services. And as a part of that, we try to highlight a lot of the great work that's going on in the country and around the world. And so we do several webinars and trainings and whatnot. So we're very happy about today's webinar. And I'll be introducing the panelists today. And our first speaker is Nev Jones from the Felton Institute, and also with the Bay Area Hearing Voices Network. Nev, are you on? Were you able to make it on? Okay, Nev may be having some technical.
Oh, sorry. It was on mute. Hi. Yeah, we're having some technical challenges on our end that we're trying to figure out in real time, but we can just go ahead and start with introduction. The topic of the webinar is really kind of an attempt to envision what specialized early intervention and psychosis services could optimally look like from kind of a more visionary, transformative perspective, and we're going to be setting that up with some research that our team has been doing, as well as sort of lessons learned from the broader literature and practice community, and then moving into kind of our vision of what things could look like. My name is Nev Jones, and I'll pass this around to all of the panelists. I'm the Director of Research for the Felton Institute in San Francisco and Director of the Division for Client-Centered Outcomes Research in Public Mental Health. I have been very active in this kind of early intervention space for many years now, with a focus on transformative change, moving programs towards more of a person-centered, recovery-oriented culture, and some more specific pieces like really kind of supporting young people's functional goals in the area of higher education and community integration. And I myself went through an early intervention program a little over a decade ago, one of the earliest such programs really in the US. so I have a very kind of personal connection to this particular area. And I think my own experiences really taught me both the potential and some of the pitfalls or limitations or the gaps in terms of where we really need to maybe change things, to innovate. So that's kind of who I am, and I'm going to just pass it on to Asha next.
Hi, I'm Asha Pasalakwa. I'm currently working for the Mental Health Association of Alameda County for PrEP Alameda, which is an early intervention program that stands for Prevention and Recovery in Early Psychosis. I'm a peer support specialist here, and I'm coming from a place of having had my own lived experience and finding peer support to have been really the critical main gateway to my recovery. So part of the experience here at PrEP Alameda has been bringing peer support more in line with the peer model and the PrEP model. And I identify strongly with somatic practices and try to bring those alternative perspectives into my work with young adults. And that's me. And I'll just be passing it on to Anthony Vasquez.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anthony Vasquez. I am the Stakeholder Engagement Manager at Dalton Institute, part of the research division. And I mostly work with staff and also clients of our programs or participants of our programs, doing qualitative interviews, learning more about their experiences in the programs, what they feel is effective, what they feel is not so effective, different ways that we can sort of improve what it is that we're doing. Additionally, I also provide technical assistance for staff in terms of like producing manuals, toolkits, flyers, just sort of like promotional materials that we share with the public, sort of about where the research is with in terms of psychosis, in terms of mental health and wellness as well. So I guess I'll go ahead and pass it up to Bea.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bea Bonner. I'm the peer support specialist for PrEP San Francisco, and working with individuals at the site and getting the peer program going. I have my own lived experience, which has inspired me to want to do this work. And I'll pass it along to Dina.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dina Tyler. I am the Peer and Family Services Director for the PrEP program and BEAM programs for all the 4 sites in the Bay Area. I've been with the PrEP Alameda program. I was there for 6 years at that site, building peer support and family support within that program. And then last year I moved over to work for all the PrEP sites to build the peer and family services and recovery-oriented services there. I have my own lived experience and went through the mental health system in my early 20s, and then got involved to try to bring these services and programs from the inside and help to create them as more recovery-oriented. And we're all good? Okay.
All right, great. So, Oryx, if you want to go ahead and just advance to the slides. I'm not sure if something might be going wrong because we're not seeing the slides on our end. We're just still seeing the first title slide. Oryx? Oryx?
Sorry about that.
Oh, okay.
We're having some technical difficulties, and I think I figured out what the problem was. Are people able to see the slides now?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. Great. Okay, so you can go ahead and advance to the next slide. Okay, great. So, all right, so we thought we'd kick off the webinar with a little bit of a deeper dive into one of the research projects that Felton's C-Corps division has undertaken. And really the primary goal of the project is to better understand who our early intervention programs are and aren't serving, and what leads to participants, to young people opting to withdraw or leaving under suboptimal circumstances. And basically what we pursued is a careful and really very systematic coding of hundreds of psychosocial assessments and case notes. So for those of you who are not researchers, really most research uses outcome variables, you know, something like whether a client's working or not, that a researcher or administrator has just selected in advance. And this often leads to significant limitations in terms of what we're actually able to learn, and often kind of a failure to really capture complexities, messiness, and all the different factors that are actually converging to shape people's experiences on the ground. So our approach was different, and it was to really kind of code everything that clinicians were recording about participants' backstory, their history, which includes, you know, histories of interactions with the criminal justice system, mental health and social services, their childhoods, their social and cultural backgrounds. So all of these things that might give us deeper insight into how to better support them. And at the same time, we are doing a series of direct interviews, as Anthony mentioned, with participants and young people, both in our program now and who have left, really trying to understand from their perspective what's working and what's not. So our EIP programs and the communities they serve are really diverse, including both inner city and rural agricultural areas. And Northern California in general is one of the most ethnically diverse parts of the U.S. So this is reflected in our sample. The majority of participants are Latino, and then large white, African American, and Asian American subgroups. Okay, so next slide, Oryx. In terms of kind of a big picture overview of what happens in these programs, about 40% of our participants disengage from services. And kind of in the broader literature on early intervention, the range is about 25 to 50%. And by disengagement, we mean withdrawing from services against the advice of the provider team. At discharge, about 20% of the young people leaving our program have met all treatment goals. And in general, what this means is that they're successfully navigating whatever mental health challenges, address distressing aspects of their experiences, and are either working or in school or both. In many cases, people are, you know, in school and also working part-time jobs. 31% of our participants, on the other hand, leave with no goals met. So in some cases, this might mean that they're homeless or living in a shelter, and often really struggling. So our goal was really to better understand, you know, these clients who are leaving the program, under kind of, you know, worrisome circumstances in terms of, you know, what are they going through, what supports are they getting. When we kind of looked at the factors driving these outcomes, we decided to compare those who were doing well versus those who don't to kind of try to identify what the key drivers are. And Orcs, you can just advance to the next slide. Okay, so you know, in more kind of qualitative terms, the kind of patterns that we saw were among those, you know, again, who left with no treatment goals met, really significant intersecting background disadvantage, including long service histories, and these were often for trauma or for putative conduct disorders, right? So youth maybe in the foster care system who were then moved over to juvenile hall or to forensic placements, poverty and socioeconomic stressors, parents who were out of work, family who were out of work, all, you know, living in, you know, 10 family members living in a 2-bedroom apartment, family homelessness, so not just the young person themselves being homeless when they came into our program, but their entire family, other forms of housing instability, individual trauma, foster care placement. So you can kind of see quantitatively from the list that individual trauma, which was an aggregate category, structural adversity, were both very significant, as well as sexual abuse more specifically. Young people kind of in this category also were often coming in with an array of non-psychotic diagnoses and past hospitalizations for, you know, self-harm or suicide attempts. So not for, you know, experiences conventionally labeled psychosis, but for other reasons. And in many cases, those hospitalizations were involuntary. And, you know, also a significant percentage of these young people reported as disagreeing with a clinical explanation of their problems, and or expressing the belief to their providers that clinical services would not be of help, that they felt that that was not what was needed to kind of address their struggles in life. And family support was also significant, but I want to really contextualize that because it was largely an inability of families because of so many other stressors and forms of adversity that they were facing to maybe support their loved ones in the same way that, you know, families living under better circumstances could, or the whole family you know, living in a very, very poor neighborhood, you know, surrounded by gang violence and kind of, you know, consider the neighborhood dangerous. Race ethnicity was very significant. So African American and Latino clients about twice as likely to fall into this group. Okay, so next slide. Okay, and when we looked at disengagement, we saw very similar patterns with a few exceptions. So, for example, overall trauma was not significant, but sexual abuse was, as well as immigration, so having come to the U.S. as a child or adolescent, and most often this was from Mexico or Latin America, and not under the easiest of circumstances, with very little, for instance, kind of financial resources. And then also past incarceration. And notably for both kind of outcome areas, disengagement and treatment goals, psychosis, you know, symptoms, which is what gets a lot of attention from researchers and clinicians in general, did not significantly predict where people would fall into these categories. And in both, you know, again, in both cases, we saw the racial ethnic disparities. So again, Latino and African American clients about twice as likely to disengage, to just opt to leave early intervention services. Okay, so next slide works. Okay, so the next slide is really just a summary of what I've already said, and to sort of set the tone for the remainder of the webinar, I just kind of want to reframe things as a series of questions. So I think what we really want to ask and move towards answering, or at least envisioning, is if our goal is to significantly impact the lives of all young people entering these programs, what can we actually do to better and engage those from, for instance, underrepresented minority groups, those who have experienced significant background adversity and trauma and may have a very hard time trusting providers or trusting the system, those who don't believe that something called psychosis is the source of their problems. And our vision, which we'll sketch in greater detail later on in the webinar, is really a vision that tries to imagine what a program would look like, what values it would hold to, that would optimally serve the needs of all young people, with the greatest attention to kind of those at the highest risk, in large part because of the amount of disadvantage they've already experienced. Okay, so if you can just advance to the next slide. And I'm going to hand this over to Anthony now. Just really quickly, just want to say that our goal with this section in terms of gaps is to kind of go beyond just this research project and these kind of experiences from our program that we've been talking about, which is of course just one part of the United States, one set of programs, and move to kind of what the broader literature tells us about all these complicated and messy intersections. So here's Anthony.
Okay, thanks, Mav. So, Lars, can you advance to the next slide? So we'll start off by talking about trauma and then lead into how this is connected to structural adversity, because even though we've tried to sort of segment these out into discernible chunks, these are all really interconnecting, and it's really difficult to try and disentangle them. So one of the things that we know about trauma is that it's one of the most significant risk factors for developing psychosis. And when we talk about trauma, some examples are sexual and physical abuse, bullying, neighborhood violence, early disruption of relationships with primary caregivers. These are just some sort of examples of what we're thinking about when we say this word trauma. Then there's also trauma such as that sort of is experienced after or stemming from a diagnosis, which can significantly shape the experiences of voices, or other distressing experiences that people have, such as hearing the voice of an abuser. And so trauma that is associated with this is involuntary treatment, discrimination, or social exclusion, and then that really connects with structural adversity, which we'll talk about later. And in a way, trauma is like sort of a quote unquote risk factor for disengagement. Childhood trauma is significantly more prevalent in young people at ultra high risk for psychosis compared to healthy controls. Participants attending early psychosis clinics report high rates of childhood trauma. For example, 54% report emotional abuse, 23% report physical abuse, 28% report sexual abuse. Women are significantly more likely to experience emotional and sexual abuse themselves. People who have been sexually assaulted as children are 3.3 times more likely to see visual hallucinations and 3.5 times more likely to hear voices than those who have not. So that's just sort of to reiterate the point that there is this connection, this deep connection between trauma and psychosis. And Oryx, can you advance to the next slide? So some sort of examples that we've just taken sort of abstractly and more generally of the sort of things we've been seeing. One example of how people can experience trauma is the family is low socioeconomic status, or they have limited resources. So resource scarcity as a generative force for trauma. Parent is a day laborer and undocumented. So being undocumented itself, and this will connect more strongly for structural adversity, and we'll come back to this, but that itself is one of the things that we've seen. Housing being tenuous, the neighborhood being in an area impacted by gangs, or the family being homeless, substance abuse in the family. But these are just some of the examples of what it is that we're seeing. Oryx, can you advance to the structural adversity?
Hi, this is B. A lot of people are experiencing trauma due to structural adversity. Structural discrimination significantly increases the risk of developing psychosis. The types of adversity that people are dealing with include racism, living in a disadvantaged neighborhood, a neighborhood that's being influenced strongly by violence and crime, socioeconomic stressors, and homelessness and housing instability.
Okay, Oryx, could you advance to the next slide on poverty?
Yeah, just to jump in, we just have a few additional qualitative examples. Again, kind of just picking up on what Anthony was saying before. These give you some examples of patterns that we've been seeing again and again in terms of what people are up against. That is both, impacting on the experiences that they have in direct and indirect ways. Including a lot of the specific kind of content of voices and of unusual beliefs that might include things like, the voices represent, figures from a gang that's after them, or the voice of an abuser. Okay, Bart, you can go on.
And hi, everyone. This is Dina. So having a low socioeconomic status or living in poverty can have a huge impact on a person's life, as financial support is not as available within the family. So for instance, a parent may not be able to afford public transportation for themselves or their loved one to get to a group at the office. So we have to be thinking about how we create our services to create access for people in these kinds of economic situations. If parents are paid low wages, they may have to work multiple jobs, which can reduce their availability to other family members for emotional support, time, and energy. This greatly impacts both the family members and participants' ability to engage in services, as office hours may conflict with work schedules, or perhaps there's not a family member available to bring someone to appointments. So financial restraints also means that one's housing situation may be affected. The family or individual may have to live in a community that has higher crime or increased drug use. The stability of housing may be a huge concern. For instance, gentrification has been a big issue here in the Bay Area, and that pushes people out of their communities and into ones that are unsafe or have less access to quality educational systems. There can be overcrowded living situations, as extended family members all have to live under the same roof. And individuals living in poverty are at greater risk for individual trauma and other forms of adversity, such as victimization and exploitation, are more likely in high crime communities. And many people in these situations either experience a violent act firsthand, have witnessed violence in their neighborhood, or know of someone who has been killed or hurt. This kind of trauma can greatly impact a person's sense of safety in the world and with other people, and affect engagement, for instance, by not feeling safe enough to leave the house, or making connections with people, like having a harder time feeling safe enough to begin to trust someone.
Okay, and next slide, Oryx. So this is just a brief recap, just that there are significant racial ethnic disparities. More work has been done to kind of unpack these in Canada and the UK than the US so far. but we see, for instance, significant differences in what gets termed pathways to care, meaning young people from minority communities are often much more likely to have police contact before they ever get to an early intervention service, and exponentially more likely to be involuntarily versus voluntarily hospitalized. It pretty kind of relatively consistent finding that minority, young people or just clients in the public mental health system are more likely to disengage from treatment, which I think we really have to understand and frame as the burden being on the provider or the provider networks, right? That it's not that the bad client, quote unquote, is disengaging, that it's the systems are not meeting the needs adequately of folks from these groups. There's been a little bit of work looking at the relationship between childhood adversity and ethnic minority status, because we see elevated rates of psychosis among certain ethnic minority groups like Afro-Caribbeans in the UK. And a big piece of that can be explained by increased childhood adversity and neighborhood adversity. Okay, next slide.
So under cultural issues, part of the gap is kind of approaching the cultural context can influence the particular content of anomalous experiences that are considered psychosis. Conceptualization of psychosis as one or more distinct neuropsychiatric disorders didn't take hold until the 19th centuries. And that often means that they don't map onto the experience described by clients. So the content of experiences are often pretty contextualized based on someone's personal and cultural histories and their dynamic relationship to identity. And these two slides will have individual extensions. Yeah. So cultural competency requires that we have pretty unilaterally motivations towards understanding the ancestral, the cultural, and the religious context of an individual's experience. And under that as well, gender identity and sexual orientation are also significant factors that are intimately connected with an individual's experience of psychosis. And in the next few slides, I'll talk a little bit more about that. So in terms of content, cultural context can influence, like I said, the particular content of anomalous experiences that are considered psychosis. For instance, in developed nations, one may experience like special messages of being under surveillance or tracked by the CIA, whereas in more traditional societies, the experience of psychosis may deal more intimately with being possessed by spirits, or more specifically, culture-bound symptoms. Specifically, also the cultural orientation of a particular society towards psychosis can influence the individual's pathway to recovery. So Western perspectives are pretty traditionally inviting of a pathological orientation. Westerners may be taught to recognize hearing voices as a pathology, whereas hearing voices in many cultures is not an automatic warrant for a psychological problem. The Hearing Voices Network, originating from the UK, is now increasingly spreading throughout the West and has offered a platform and support system for exploring the hearing voices experience without the use of a medical model lens, increasing that sort of accessibility in the West. One particular study by a psychological anthropologist, Tanya Lerman, indicates that in 488 societies, out of 488 societies worldwide, hallucinations played a significant role in just ordinary ritual practice in 62% of them, which is to link to the potential for religious and spiritual perspectives in our understanding of psychosis, and that personal or religious and spiritual content can have a significant role in determining the content, interpretation, and response to experiences. Religious or spiritual content can be particularly meaningful in the interpretation of certain voices, such as, for instance, some young clients that I've had who have been able to work through grief and trauma through understanding their voices through a spiritual lens. Some clients may also experience what may be known as a spiritual emergence or emergency. And it's important to acknowledge that what may be a spiritually meaningful experience for an individual may not necessarily be a case for pathology or consideration of psychosis. Next slide, please. So the second part is to think about the influence of queerness and gender and sexual identity in the pathologization of psychosis. So homosexuality wasn't removed from the DSM until 1973, and this just to say and point to that the pathologization of sexuality and gender is still fairly recent and in some ways still active within certain medical model approaches. And we don't really fully understand the effect of the experience of a diagnosis in the experience of, say, gender dysphoria. Often diagnostic language is a gateway and formality into receiving services, but that does not mean it is necessary to impose such an identity upon a service user. Although gender dysphoria in particular is not described explicitly as a medical disorder, still a diagnostic term used to categorize someone's experience in an explicitly medical way, which may not align with an individual's perspective of their experience or identity. Clinicians and in general practitioners have to recognize this dual stigma that may arise from having a mental illness experience diagnosis, as well as discrimination due to gender identity or sexual orientation being looked upon in a diagnostic way. And particular examples that I've had working with individuals is that there have been times where, queerness has been considered to be an element of their psychosis by family members, and poor education and poor approaches through the broader clinical team in educating family members that queerness is by no means a mental disorder, but that discrimination, oppression, and the consequent trauma that such individuals experience can be what leads to an increased risk for psychosis. And so just moving forward, the importance is to recognize the danger of stigmatizing queer and trans youth through the pathologization of their unique gender experience and conflating it with a psychosis experience, and therefore increasing research that considers an individual's mental health challenges in the context of their gender and sexual identities. Next slide, please.
Okay, and then just kind of a little bit of a summary slide, and also just to say we've now, I think, kind of tried to lay out some of these really major issues that impact on, risk of developing psychosis, people's background experiences, their experiences getting to early intervention programs, and then end programs. And so one question is kind of what interventions are already available to fill these gaps? So for the most part, early intervention programs, their forte, their strength is an ability to focus on symptoms and kind of symptom-focused program elements. So cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis might be one example. And then for kind of cognitive challenges, we see various forms of cognitive remediation out there, or kind of attempts to integrate that into early intervention programs. There's some work on integrating supported employment and to some extent supported education models into early intervention. Mostly this has been IPS model, which stands for Individual Placement and Support, and is a registered evidence-based practice. Family work is pretty standard, but mostly has centered around multifamily psychoeducation, multifamily groups to date. And we do see this kind of very preliminary emergence of components with a different focus, and just want to walk through a couple of quick examples. TRIP is a trauma-focused therapy that's been developed at the EPIC program in Melbourne, Australia. And it's specialized for working with trauma experiences within an early intervention setting. EPIC has also developed an intensive case management, kind of a stepped up program for higher risk clients, and a big piece of that heightened risk is background adversity and experiences, and so kind of they need more support. Exploring use of the housing first model, specifically for early intervention youth in Montreal, Canada. Then there's some projects and some programs that have really focused much more on how one brings kind of youth or service user or client voice into a program in various different ways, including clinician training and support, as well as kind of integrated leadership. So there's the platform team, again, at EPIC in Melbourne, and similar, really strong youth presence in the Headspace program in Australia and Jigsaw in Ireland. And then in Sussex, the I Project. So this was a completely youth co-designed engagement process, looking at how, from a youth perspective, do you really kind of introduce other youth to what early intervention is, how should clinicians be trained, what are kind of all the materials that should be there both in the program and that clinicians are actively using. In the UK, there's been some work also on what there gets termed as kind of third sector linked peer support. So entities, peer-run organizations, or local charities that are apart from the early intervention program but work with the early intervention staff. So, formally work with them to get the youth out into the community and involved outside of the context of kind of the direct clinical services. We at CCOR, with funding from NASHBID and SAMHSA, created a series of toolkits to better support students with early psychosis in higher education, really focusing on kind of trying to tackle some of the more structural and systemic barriers that young people face in community college and universities, et cetera. And then there have been some developments in kind of alternative ways of supporting families, including Krista McKinnon's work here in the United States with Recovering Our Families. Okay, so we're next, you can advance Oryx, and the next and kind of final section we're now moving into is our vision for what things, would ideally look like. And we as a group spent a while discussing this and really feel like, at the center, what needs to be there is healing. And kind of intentionally chose that word versus recovery or, any number of other words that we could have picked, because it really is about that kind of holistic sense of people have had so many experiences that have maybe, broken them in some ways. And we've walked through many, many different examples of that. And it's that sort of holistic sense of who they are as a person, as an individual that needs healing. And kind of elements that we think contribute to this that we're going to talk about are kind of the workplace environment, by which we mean kind of the structure and training of early intervention teams, the space and how welcoming it is, peer support and kind of different forms of peer support, including family peer support, and how that can kind of promote this process of healing in a different way, maybe from more traditional professional support, and then engagement and kind of what that means. So I will turn it over to B now, and you can advance to the next slide.
Can you go to the slides for welcoming space?
Oh, okay. Sorry, guys. Just we're a big team trying to integrate the slides. Okay, so before we get into welcoming space, just kind of an overview here. about cultural transformation. And a lot of, I think, what we've all grappled with in terms of our own work with early intervention is the need for deeper cultural shift, not just the more kind of superficial or ameliorative, tweaking this, tweaking that, but this deeper way in which, all the members of teams or of programs can kind of hold a different vision of things, different values. So this includes equipping programs to really respond to the structural adversity that we've been talking about throughout this webinar. And if we want to talk about this in terms of specific competencies, cultural competence or cultural humility, structural competence, trauma-informed care, and then kind of a deeper dive into what kind of constitutes a recovery orientation or recovery culture. And one tool that we've used a lot here is Mark Reagan's kind of recovery orientation process measures, because they and happy to give the links to anybody who might be interested, but they really focus on really concretely operationalizing what things would ideally look like and what kind of different markers of the stage at which a program is at might look like. So I just want to point out that these are things that there don't exist in the United States, at least to the best of our knowledge, a lot of available trainings or kind of go-to places where you would get, for instance, an early psychosis structural competency training or trauma-informed care that was really adapted to kind of, young people coming into these early intervention programs. The flexibility to respond to young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, meaning if somebody is coming in and their family's in a shelter when they're coming into the program, how can that look? That we would hope that would look very different, the ways that a program would be equipped to engage with them than somebody who's stably housed and, living with their parents in a nice neighborhood. And then really proactively targeting the forces that are driving poor outcomes and disengagement, and a key piece of that would be systems work. So moving away from, just the clinical team mostly focused on individual level problems and trying to think about how early intervention, advocates, leaders, providers can work with other systems and across systems to kind of enact more structural change and push for that. Okay, next slide. Okay, and now I will pass on to B.
So welcoming space, the physical space of a program is the participant's first impression of you and your colleagues and the perceived openness of the services. For those that don't agree with the medical explanation of their challenges, it's helpful that the office feels like a communal healing space as opposed to a place to get treatment. Giving the space a sense of homeliness can include the creation of hospitality through providing coffee, tea, and printed resources. Sharing spaces with team members and participants helps to facilitate an environment where participants are not viewed as othered and are fully part of the team and their care. In dealing with structural discrimination, there are few places that many people who feel marginalized feel that they can go. So it's important for this space to be a place where people can come and feel comfortable and feel safe. It's also important that people are in an environment where they can engage with each other rather than walls or barriers. For those that have been in locked facilities or in prison, it could be a similar feeling or situation depending on how the facility is set up. It's also important for the facility to be in a central location so that people can access it by public transportation, and also just to create a more communal space with it being central to all of the participants. It should also reflect the diverse views and backgrounds and opinions and passions of the people in the program. So incorporating participants into the setting up and decorating and appearance of the space, and also the material that's provided to people.
Okay, and next slide, Org. And I'm going to talk about engagement now. And since there have been, such high rates of disengagement in early psychosis programs, so building connection is the key to engagement. It's important to be real, be one's authentic self, as people can sense when someone is being dishonest or not being genuine. And welcoming into the program, like Bea mentioned, is so important. So face-to-face introductions with the team members should be done as early on as possible so people can start to build connections and want to engage with the program. And with assessment and intake, be mindful of how the person first experiences your program. So are they asked a lot of questions during the intake? Are the sensitive questions asked in a detached manner? Do you have to get them to fill out all the paperwork first? Or can you start to build the connection, trust, and relationship first? Consider traumas or history of loss that may have been caused unintentionally by providers. A person may have had many short-term providers. They may have gone through multiple hospitalizations. So they may have been asked the same invasive questions over and over in their lives. And this can affect their trust in providers or willingness to talk about their experiences. Consider if the program's language is very clinical and not empowering or hopeful. So remain aware of how some language can be offensive. Also keep in mind the power dynamics in your attempts to engage someone. Do you have the power to hospitalize someone? Did a previous hospitalization lead to disengagement in your therapeutic relationship? Do they feel you are giving them choice, or do they feel they have to comply with your treatment suggestions? So don't impose a framework for understanding their experience. Invite dialogue instead. Also keep in mind to think about how you enter a situation and be aware of how you may affect it. How you dress, wearing a badge, your race, your beliefs, even your energy level. Are you trying to converse at a matched pace to what they need? Pay attention to even the smallest hint of them shutting down or disconnecting, and switch up what you're doing. So be comfortable with extended periods of silence. Refrain from the feeling that you as a provider always have to be doing or asking something. Understand the vulnerability that it takes for a person to open up to someone new. People want to be listened to, understood, and accepted. And depending on what kinds of trauma or adversity they have encountered in their life, this may take time for a person to trust that you're not going to be another person that's going to let them down. Find a balance of aiming for acceptance by them and being your complete honest self. For instance, don't pretend to like or know about something you don't just to gain acceptance. People can see through that, and it will affect your ability to gain trust in other areas. So make yourself a little vulnerable, sharing personal experience of navigating an obstacle or being a young adult trying to gain independence. Also, don't be offended if someone refuses your help. Stay consistent. Engagement can be a long, slow process. Look for opportunities to get a foot in the door. Like, find out what their interests are and talk about those. Ask questions about their culture, beliefs, their style, and be willing to learn from them. Have them teach you something. Offer to go with them to something in the community that they are interested in. And breaking bread is a great way to get a foot in the door. Offer to buy them lunch, a coffee, or a smoothie. A very important part of making your program a welcoming space is to create a sense of belonging and community. Having orientations can be a great way of starting to create community right from the beginning, and graduations to recognize their time in the program, how they affected the staff and other participants, and honor their transition. Inviting current participants to graduations can be a great way for someone to see someone else being honored and want that for themselves when they complete the program. Orientations, graduations, and public events are also a great way to involve family members so that they can also find a sense of community through your program. So, for instance, organize movie screenings and discussions, both at the office and out in the community. Bring in speakers with lived experience to share their personal story. Think about if there's an outside facilitator who leads a group in the community to facilitate something at your office. This way, you can start to help participants in your program build a larger community that they can access if they disengage or discharge from services. A key element to engagement is to keep in mind that they have a purpose in the relationship too, and that it is not just as a receiver of services, that instead they have important things to offer as well. So make sure to stay aware for ways that they may be interested in getting involved with helping to build community. Helping with groups and events, giving feedback, or moments when they can help others to feel a sense of belonging. Often when someone is disengaging from services, it's a great time to bring in a peer supporter if one has not already been introduced. I have often been brought in to offer peer support as a re-engagement strategy with someone who is missing appointments or wanted to discharge from the program. And could we go to the next slide, Org? Incorporating both clinical and peer support approaches in early psychosis intervention programs can greatly increase engagement because clinical and peer staff can come from different angles to find the best ways to support the mental and sociocultural diversity of the people we serve. And next slide. So a peer can refer to many different things. It can refer to someone that is close in age to a young adult or someone of equivalent status. But in the context of mental health services, it refers to someone with personal lived experience of the mental health system. It is an emerging term that more people prefer over consumer. However, there are multiple ways in which it is used, so it can often need some clarification. And these are the reasons why this term is still debated. There are people with lived experience, either personal or as a family member, who are then hired to work in clinical roles, such as a therapist or a case manager. Sometimes the word peer can be used to refer to a family member that has helped a loved one navigate the mental health system, and those family members then work in the mental health system and run family support groups or provide individual support to family members. But what I'm going to focus on is those with their own personal lived experience of mental health issues who work as peer specialists and provide peer support. The definition of a peer supporter is someone who has firsthand knowledge of the healing process of a mental health struggle and building resiliency. They may have had similar experiences and backgrounds to the participants in the program, like trauma, racism, sexual orientation or gender identity discrimination, structural disadvantages, navigating social service or justice systems. Peers may have personally experienced voices or unusual beliefs. They can offer genuine compassion and hope that it is possible to come through those struggles stronger with more clarity and purpose. Next slide, please. Peer support is an evidence-based practice. It is a non-hierarchical relationship between the participant and peer supporter, and is a system of mutual support and learning founded on the key principles of hope, equality, respect, personal responsibility, and self-determination. Peer specialists practice trauma-responsive care by being trained to hold people in unconditional high regard and remain non-judgmental in their interactions. as they are sensitive to participants' needs to connect on a human level versus only as an interaction with a paid expert. A peer support relationship is about openly listening to what a person has to say, by responding strategically by sharing parts of their own personal story, and creating spaces for mutual learning. This opens up the possibility of different ways of exploring meaning and impact of one's experiences of extreme states of consciousness and providing hope and inspiration that is tangible. Peers avoid pushing any kind of personal agenda and can share mutually without the constraints of the traditional expert-patient relationship. This creates the possibility of trust for those whose relationships have been repeatedly trust-breaking or disempowering by having others do things to you or for you. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide. The relationship is key in peer support. Coming from the perspective that each person is an expert on themselves, the role of a peer supporter is to empower the individual to find out what best works for them to take care of themselves. Peers can play a critical role in building and sustaining a welcoming space, and also serve as advocates to help transform services to include more wellness, recovery, and resiliency-based care. This can have a huge impact on service teams as well by drawing attention to how the social context, like social distancing, stigma, and firmly held beliefs or views of othering, can impact a person's sense of belonging and willingness to engage. Peers can reinforce a recovery culture by breaking down an us versus them structure, moving conversations away from a focus on illness or disorder or symptoms, and back to a common humanity that we all share of being both givers and receivers of support. Peers can improve outcomes through effective engagement, to reduce involuntary care, and through inspiring others to take personal responsibility over their wellness, as peers themselves have firsthand knowledge of the healing process. Oh.
The workplace. Critical reflexivity of team hierarchies, use of diagnosis and clinical language, ability to work to clients' own explanatory framework, what gets prioritized and deprioritized, language used with participants, but also in team meetings. Teams without hierarchies allow for a wide range of diverse opinions and experiences to be considered and have a better chance of reflecting the diversity of participant desires. Helping others cannot consist of making assumptions and should be informed through the lens that individuals view their experiences. People must look at their life experiences instead of using rigid diagnosis and clinical language to determine what types of support will be helpful to an individual. Teams must work with an individual's explanatory framework that allows for a participant to give meaning and value to their own life and experiences and prioritize personal needs and goals that they see for themselves. Consistency in language is also important. It is important that the language that is used is hopeful, empowering, and non-judgmental, and is not only used with participants themselves, but also when teams are meeting amongst each other. All members meeting a participant early on will help to increase participant engagement with each member of the team, and to ensure that every participant has access and is aware of every resource that the team is available to provide in achieving their personal goals. Team trainings on recovery and recovery culture are important in creating a workplace culture where recovery culture and its components are not only embraced, but also well understood. In order for these trainings to be most effective, individuals with lived experience and youth should regularly be involved in the training of staff. It's important to create a culture where people are not only seeing team members during their meeting time, but also are able to acknowledge the accomplishments of participants through ceremonies and events. These events can also be done through educational nights and community events in order for participants and staff to get to know each other better and celebrate one another. In order to better meet the needs of participants, the hours that team members are available should be a reflection of the availability and life schedules of the participants. Having a central location that is accessible by public transportation allows individuals to be able to travel to the office where the team is located and helps ensure that travel time is less lengthy. The care that is provided should be the care that the participant finds of value to them. This care includes participants creating their own care plans and wellness goals. The early introduction to the entire team and inclusion of peer and family support in team meetings is important to continuing to value the role of peers and family supporters and increasing engagement.
Next slide, please. So healing, really coming back to the center point of this culture of inclusion, is really about centering the participants' own experience and explanations of their experience. And you can take this deeper through facilitated open exploration, whether through peer support or therapy or any other kind of dialogue or engagement that you're having. It's really important to stress and kind of question the individual to, reflect on how their experiences have been meaningful and how they have been involved in creating or recovering their identity. Part of the recovery process may be exploring or integrating the experiences that they have had, the experience of receiving a diagnosis or not, and the consequent shift in how they may relate to themselves and the world. Supporting individuals through this developmental process, especially during the incredibly critical identity formation years that we see as transition age youth, 16 to 24. It's critical to normalize and humanize these challenges during this time period. You're coming to adulthood and also experiencing all these shifts in how you feel you relate to yourself and your family and perhaps a broader social reality. So all those have to be taken into consideration. Community integration and inclusion being at the center is also critical. So often within clinical teams, symptom amelioration takes a back seat to meaningful schoolwork. Symptom amelioration often takes a front seat, but we want to be moving towards having it take a back seat to offering meaningful school or work, not low-wage part-time dead-end positions, stable and independent housing, healing family systems, and community involvement. So with that, it's really not centralizing the individual's quote-unquote pathology as the goal of treatment, but to really think about the full circle of support that you want to not only hold the individual through their recovery, but through their continued growth and evolving towards their life. In addition, pointing to their experiences and their association with historical and cultural backgrounds is really helpful in terms of normalizing their experiences. You can point to the arts or particular films or particular mystics or even scientists who have had experiences with hearing voices or with psychosis. And so really serving to culturally situate their experience in a broader historical legacy, and to point to the potential creative gifts or insights that their experiences may offer or provide. There was also one section that didn't get thrown into this slide last minute, and I'll try to address it really quickly, but it's on addressing holistic approaches. So in my, I have it here. So thinking about offering mindfulness-based, somatic, or even energy-oriented treatments as part of the broader level of care. These could be anything from EFT, which is an evidence-based practice focusing on working through trauma, qigong or acupuncture. Some of these practices are have been really, really helpful, in particular Tay that I have worked with and who have found these to, particularly get at somatic experiences, which are often not directly addressed through talk therapy or through medication, but was something that was incredibly helpful in empowering them to use their own body and their own practices to move through their own trauma and through their own physical experiences. Another which was inspired by compassion-focused therapy on a recent training that I experienced through Eleanor Longden, was the boosting of the soothing system. The soothing system being basically the capacity for the individual to soothe an overactive threat system. So really empowering individuals to develop compassion for themselves and for their experiences in a context where classical intervention services often focus on behavioral change, which can increase the feeling of what I'm doing isn't enough, what I'm doing is wrong, I need to change myself. So compassion-focused therapy can add an added element of self-care and self-soothing that may otherwise not be found in other intervention services. And that's it for me.
Okay, great. So we can go ahead and, if you advance, it's just moving next into the Q&A. So anything, Oryx, you wanna bring in?
Yes, thanks so much for the presentation. It's going to be a very useful resource for people, I think. And there were several questions about how do I get the PowerPoint? Will the PowerPoint be available? Yes, the PowerPoint is going to be posted at www.power2u.org. So the PowerPoint will be available. So we're going to answer questions or address questions in the order that they were received, realizing that we have about 15 minutes left on the webinar, so we're not going to be able to get to all the questions, most likely. And so if you do have questions that were not addressed, please feel free to contact us directly. You can contact us at the National Empowerment Center. There's a contact slide here that you'll see in a bit where you can contact the panelists. But let's just jump right in. The first question was, which programs are Nev specifically referring to? And this was early on in the presentation.
So probably in terms of the research, these are the Felton Institute's PrEP early intervention programs, and distinct from the Massachusetts PrEP model. So different agency, different model, but overlapping names.
Okay. By the way, one program that I don't think has been mentioned yet, it's not really a program, it's more of a practice, which may be useful for folks in these programs, is emotional CPR. And it's a training that we at the National Empowerment Center do. If you're interested in that, it's www.emotional-cpr.org. And again, it's a training that can help you to help others through emotional crises. The second question, what do you mean by not mapping onto consumers' experience?
I think there was a slide that said diagnosis and kind of the experiences that we give certain discrete labels, and a lot of that is very kind of just bound up in historical ways of understanding experiences, as well as like coming from a professional perspective. And so just in terms of my own personal research, for example, two different large sample studies looking at how auditory voices actually are, and you know, all over the map in terms of actually voices that are much more thought-like, that are auditory some of the time and thought-like some of the time, that are in between, that somebody can't even really say. So that's just kind of one example. Or a term like schizophrenia right now is under significant criticism from the scientific community, with converging evidence from genetics, from phenomenology, from epidemiology, saying this is not really a meaningful discrete term. And it doesn't map onto the patterns kind of we actually see of, you know, this kind of set of experiences or phenomena that are, you know, termed psychosis. So I think that's, you know, what's the point of that?
Yeah, that's a great answer. So the third question we got is, does anosognosia exist, and does it impact your conclusions that psychosis and resistance to treatment are caused by social factors?
Yeah, so so I think one thing that's really key that maybe we didn't make as explicit in the webinar as we could have is, I think, just the tremendous variability of people's experiences, how multifaceted they are. So so a term like anosognosia, I think most of us would say, can be kind of really unhelpful, because a participant, a young person, might reject the diagnosis for all kinds of reasons. Some of them could be very insightful. They may have a very different interpretation of what their experiences mean, or even what they actually feel like. So there can be psychological reasons why you want to sort of, or need to, I guess, psychologically dissociate from experiences. So there's so many things that can contribute to what clinicians tend to term insight, or in some cases anosognosia. And again, I think what we're pushing for in this webinar is really kind of respecting participants or young people's experiences and how they're understanding, and moving away from kind of the label that just says, well, you can't understand your own experiences. You have some fundamental brain problem that doesn't allow you, because that can have all kinds of consequences in terms of the message that it sends, and really drive disengagement, which we see a lot.
And I just want to add on too, the services themselves should be helpful regardless if someone agrees with the diagnosis or not. And so, what I see is, if our main concern is to get them to take on this diagnosis and speak about their experience in terms of the clinical language, we're going to spend a lot of our energy doing that instead, and the services that we offer in early psychosis can be helpful to one, regardless if they take on the schizophrenia label.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, what do you mean by hearing voices of an abuser? Aren't all different voices arising from the same, I think that's the same sources? The same.
A little bit, not totally sure maybe what the second part of that question was going, but increasingly in terms of research on voices specifically, I think there's been a lot of attention, by researchers and scientists to the tremendous variability in voices, and kind of the forms they take, in the content, in the relationships that voices have with each other, as well as with the individual who's hearing them or experiencing them. And there are very, very strong links between certainly trauma and voices for a subset of people who experience voices. And we often see that reflected in the voice reflecting an abusive figure in the individual's life. And I actually have a paper, on a research paper on this coming out that looks at the relationship between people's experiences of abuse and hearing or experiencing that kind of content. But that's only one example. I mean, we're not trying to say that trauma is the single source, single cause of voices. It's a very, again, very, very diverse phenomenon, and all kinds of different things can contribute to it and be reflected in the forms and the content, including culture and religion and spirituality, as well as Asha mentioned earlier, just sort of, being in a surveillance society, feeling like the CIA is able to access one's mind and sending one messages and constantly surveilling what one's thinking. So again, all these social and cultural influences are really kind of playing out in those experiences.
And I just also want to add that, not all voices that people hear are distressing. And so I just want to point out that sometimes people hear voices that are very helpful, guiding, and even comforting to them. So we're not just saying that people are just hearing voices connected to trauma.
Yeah, and he asked a follow-up question which is related to that, Dina. He said, isn't it also normal to hear voices?
Well, yes, in many cultures around the world, it is considered normal. It's considered part of human experience. And so, for instance, the Maori in New Zealand, that's an example of a culture that integrates the voice hearing experience into their spiritual beliefs.
Yes, and then a follow-up question to that. It also seems to me that some of the issues that are being discussed are more of social dilemmas.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. I mean, like social conditions, things going on in society at a given time, and especially for groups that are very marginalized. So, kind of police profiling or something, and consistent negative criminal justice system interactions, which, is obviously all over the news, just in terms of the prevalence, and something that we would, absolutely expect is going to have a major impact on people who are living in a situation where they constantly feel like they have to be looking over their shoulder because, they're actually sort of at risk from, police officers who are, in theory there to protect them and ensure safety. So, I mean, it's those kind of experiences can be very, very distressing and are not just one-off. They're these kind of background structural conditions, and some folks in the UK, researchers and clinicians, are certainly really kind of trying to better understand that when you're in the connection between living in a pervasive atmosphere of, oppression, or where you're at risk from one group or another in some way, or at risk from your own, government potentially, how that influences content and then the relationships that the individual might have with their voices. So if they feel very disempowered in real life, so to speak, that's much more likely to play out than in their relationship with voices.
Thank you. So a couple people asked about the recovery orientation process resource and getting access to more information or a link about that.
Yeah, absolutely. If anybody wants to email us, I know, or if you put the contact slide up, and I think most of us are pretty easy to find. Also, if you just Google us, and would be very happy to get you those resources. Also, maybe if Oryx has like a mass list, we could send out a follow-up document with a bunch of different resources, including the recovery process materials.
Yeah, and a lot of these resources we're posting on our website as well. So if that one, we would be happy to post it on the NEC website too,
Mm-hmm.
So that people can grab it from our site. I'd like to read, there's a comment that someone left, not so much a question, but I'd like to read it. Hi everyone, I'm writing from On Track Central in New York City. This is Sasha DeBrule, and want to thank you for all the great info. I'm thinking about your language of the need for a deeper cultural shift. I'm thinking that one way for us to be able to make this is a reality would be for more dialogue between organizations and peers working in organizations. Maybe you can mention that new listserv we've started.
Thanks. Yes, and we should absolutely get that up on the NEC site. So we do have a listserv for staff to identify as peers working in or with early intervention programs, and we're still kind of in the process of trying to get it going. We have also had some technical issues where I think there are some people who were added who may not actually be getting the emails. But if anybody is interested, please email us. We also had the more kind of grandiose idea of maybe then creating a space that was more just kind of open to anyone, but haven't gotten around to that yet, where maybe there could be more dialogue between folks who are identifying as, you know, having lived experience and the broader provider, you know, community policymakers, et cetera. So we'll make sure that that information is up. Thanks, Sasha.
Okay, and maybe time for one more question. Is Reiki considered one of the holistic practices used also?
I don't have personal experience with it, so I can't say or speak upon necessarily the benefit of it, but I have known people to use it in general for psychological distress. But again, I can't speak to necessarily the evidence backing it.
Yeah, this is Oryx. From a personal anecdotal perspective, I've found it very useful, and my wife, who is not very into a lot of this stuff, actually finds Reiki very helpful as well. So there's two anecdotal examples. Anybody else want to say anything about Reiki?
No, I think that's good. I had some experience with Reiki when I lived in Japan, and, you know, again, I would say, you know, absolutely in cultures where that's a more integrated part of kind of what, you know, seeking care, even for just, you know, physical issues, you know, very much seen as a valuable additional resource. So, yeah.
Well, at this point, I'd like to thank all the panelists and thank you for all the attendees. We had close to 200 people attend, and I know there was a lot more people interested in it. And so this webinar will be archived, so it will be available to share. There's a lot of great information in it, thanks to the panelists. And we'll close off with some references. Again, you don't need to copy all of this down. The PowerPoint will be available on the National Empowerment Center website. And there are some ways you can contact us at the National Empowerment Center as well. So with that, hope you have a great rest of your day, and good luck in the work that you do. Thank you.